Thank you, Glenn. I'll tell you what SHIRK is. It's the acronym SHIRK, and I should always assume that most people in the world don't know what that is. It's the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and so it's a national organization through the Government of Canada that grants research funding. And before I start, I'd also like to say, Simone, we're practically neighbors. I'm on Warsaw and Arbuthnot, so I was trying to envision your property there with your garden plot. If I had more energy, I'd maybe go do some gardening myself, but okay, so can I share my screen? Looks like I can.
Yes, please, you can.
Can you see it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm just going to start this then. So I'm going to talk about intergenerational poverty today. So looking at how we can break the cycle of poverty for those people who are living in poverty, in a more complex poverty than other forms of poverty. I know that your group is particularly interested in child poverty, and that's really great. So this is obviously part of that, because the reality is that children who are poor live in poor families. So I'm going to just dig into that a little deeper, and I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts when I'm done. So as Glenn introduced me, he told you that I'm from the University of Winnipeg in the Faculty of Arts in the Department of Urban and Inner City Studies. What I would like you to know about where I work is that I work in the North End at Merchants Corner. So Merchants Corner, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. But we're a university department that's off campus in the North End, and we're there for a specific reason. And it really is related to the issue of intergenerational poverty. So our primary aim is to make university more accessible to people who may otherwise not see university as an option for them. Often people who are living in poverty and have lived in poverty for generations, they don't see this as something that is for them. They see it as something for other people. So we're there to make this seem like more of a real possibility for people. Our secondary aim is to bring non-Indigenous and Indigenous people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds together to learn, while also challenging some of the stereotypes that we learn about our city and the people that live in our city. So very much what we do is really in the context of reconciliation as well. There's a very large Indigenous population in the area that we work in. So it's not uncommon for students to come to our department who are older students that have dropped out of high school or coming back as adults. And many of the students that study with us have known nothing but poverty. So we have an interesting department. We have a lot of dialogue in our classroom. I personally teach courses around public policy and poverty. And so we have a lot of discussions about this. And this is one of the things that somebody said in class one day, just basically saying, my family's always been poor, my neighbors and friends are too, and I don't really know anyone who isn't poor. So if you could imagine what that would be like and how that might have an effect on your life and the networks that you have and the opportunities that you have. So this is related again to this idea of intergenerational poverty. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a definition of this. It's essentially poverty that's transmitted from one generation to another. So, the idea that you are born into poverty. And the reality is that, as we know, children are poor because their parents are poor. So when we think about children in poverty, we have to think about them in the context of the family and their neighborhoods and all their other networks. There are many, many studies to show that children are more likely to become poor adults if they've grown up in poverty. And they in turn are more likely to have children who then grow up in poverty. And then again, that cycle continues. The likelihood of being poor in adulthood increases with the number of years that a person is in poverty. And the longer you grow up in poverty, the less likely you are to graduate from high school. So this is important in the area where I work because poverty rate's very high, and there are a number of people who are coming back to school later in life. having dropped out. And that reality is also that the longer that you are living in poverty, the less likely you are to finish high school. And then again, that's a lot to do with your parents not having completed school. It's also important to note that children who do not experience poverty as children are highly unlikely to grow up to be adults living in poverty. So it is true that sometimes people may temporarily fall into poverty, maybe lose their jobs, but there's very high unlikely, it's very highly unlikely that they will remain poor for a length of time. And then, of course, we also know that growing up poor can carry long-term health implications, can harm brain development, and have long-term implications for mental health. So when we look at people who grow up in this particular type of poverty, you can see that it is far more difficult for people to escape poverty than we might think. Another thing I'd like to just point out is the importance of understanding that it's not just about money. Now, obviously, that's critically important. People need to have a decent income to live, but living in poverty, and this particular long-term poverty, has far deeper impact on people. And one of that is that's the sense of self. So in some of the research that we've done, speaking with people who are living in poverty, this is something that one person said. They said, if a person is poor, they generally have a whole list of problems, from not having a decent education, to not having decent housing, to not having any connection to their neighborhood, and not having the self-esteem or the capacity to say that I deserve a decent life. So this idea of people feeling really not worthy of having better, that's something that's deeply ingrained in people. Another person said, when you're poor, you have no choices. I hate having no choices. Having choices gives you self-respect, dignity, self-esteem, self-control, and confidence. So again, that idea that how it has an effect on a person's sense of self. So then how do we break this cycle? So breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty, of course, is not simple. It requires access to a number of resources and supports. Certainly income is important, but it's not just, again, about money. It's far more damaging. People essentially learn to accept poverty as their destiny, and their lives become focused on day-to-day survival. So here's something, again, that another individual said when asked about, what poverty was like, what they feel about being poor, and they simply said, my feeling on being poor is that of surviving the best way I can, sharing what I have when I can. So again, this acceptance that this is the reality. So again, improving outcomes requires multiple policy tools. Here are some of them. I'm talking today specifically about education, but I'd like to make a point that there other areas are equally important. And I would also like to point out the importance of housing. This is another area that I passionately believe is needing to have far more attention. Housing is foundational, really, for people. You can have all of these other things, but if people don't have a decent home to live in, then it will be difficult for them to escape poverty. But that's a conversation for another day. So back to focusing on education. We commonly think of education as a ticket out of poverty, and then certainly this may sound simplistic, but it is really a very important tool. But it's also the case that for many people, and particularly when we think about Indigenous people, education has been an extremely negative experience, and sometimes a traumatic experience, and that again passes down to people of to the next generation. So in previous research that I've done in this area, some individuals describe their parents as having a deep mistrust and cynicism with regard to education as a result of their experiences with residential schools, or their grandparents, again, this transmitted intergenerationally. Others talked about it not really being discouraged, but not really encouraged either. So they'd say that they didn't really talk about poverty in their households. They didn't talk about education. They essentially just learned that this was the norm, that the circumstances that they lived in. And so we can see that it's had a deep effect, and again, has an effect on poverty in terms of the long term. One individual said this about his experience about poverty and education. And he talked about actually not really ever really knowing he was poor when he was young. He was, happy and felt loved by his parents, but it was when he turned 6 and went to school where he started to feel things change. So growing up in an Ojibwe community, not speaking the language, first learning to read and write English, he said it was very difficult for him, but he also said he learned about racism because of being called names. So he learned that racism was a real thing, being the target of that racism. And he said, fighting off bigger boys who thought it was fun to beat up poor Indians. And so again, this is what happens when people are feeling multiple issues around the effects of poverty, the effects of racism, and then they often end up not finishing school. This is something that was shared with me by a person who works in an elementary school here in the city in a more affluent neighborhood, but where there's a public housing complex. And they said to me that the kids from this public housing complex, they come to grade 1 with bright eyes, excited to be there, just like all the other kids, same expectations. But all too often, the light in their eyes soon fades, and they quickly learn that they are different. They are treated differently. They start to see that they're different. They start to see that they're inferior. And she says that they start to believe and to see that they are the charity cases. They stop attending, they fall behind, and then they're gone. And she said, I don't know where they end up, but I imagine poverty follows them. So again, this idea that kids learn early that they're different, that they're inferior, and it's because, you know, of the way we view people living in poverty. So again, breaking the cycle for me is again complicated, but I believe strongly that giving parents hope will then give kids hope. And so this is why my interest is in looking at how we intervene at very different levels to address child poverty. It makes sense, of course, to focus on child poverty. We want to create opportunities for children to escape poverty. But if these children are living in poor families, we need to think about their parents as well. So this is an example of a student who came back to school in her late 20s, a single parent, grew up in the area around where Merchants Corner is situated there on Selkirk and Andrew Street. And she's now finished her Bachelor of Arts degree. She came having dropped out of high school. She's graduated. She's actually graduated 4 years ago. I spoke with her recently to see where she was at, and she continues to work as a community justice worker in the community, loves her job, and had a great experience in university. But most importantly, she said, I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and my son now sees this as something that everyone does. And so at 7 years old, he talks about what he's going to take when he gets into university. So again, this is the idea of this breaking the cycle by giving her son hope, because he sees the hope that she has and how that's worked out for her. So this is just a picture of where our department is located. Some of you might be familiar with this building. It used to be a pretty dangerous place on the corner of Selkirk and Andrews, and it's now an intergenerational learning center. We share space with CETA Pathways to Educations. They offer education or after-school programming for kids from grade 8 to 12, giving them supports to try to encourage them to stay in school. There's a very high dropout rate in our neighborhood. And then they also see then that there's other possibilities in the building because there's students studying in university. So they see, oh, maybe this is something I can do. Maybe I can to go to university. The other thing that we do is we bring, again, students together from different socioeconomic backgrounds to provide them with a work-learn experience. And so they're taking a course through the summer months, but they're also getting a paid job working in a community organization in the inner city. And they're working together, people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds with students coming from more privileged backgrounds. So it's really a way to start challenging stereotypes, building awareness, breaking barriers, addressing racism, and just developing empathy. I like to show these two students because this is a perfect example of the type of student that we're encouraging to participate in our department. So Chelsea is from the neighborhood. She's a single mom and actually lives in the housing that's attached. We have social housing attached to our educational space, and she's graduating this year with her bachelor's degree. And Riley is a student, he graduated a couple years ago now, who lives in the suburbs, comes from a very privileged background. And when he applied to the program, he said that he felt that he'd never had a meaningful conversation with an Indigenous person and felt that needed to change for him. And so he applied for to our program and spent the summer working with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in the inner city. So again, a value experience, but also showing you how we can really challenge some of these stereotypes. This is just a little example of the types of students that study with us. So diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, and age as well. We have students from 18 to 50 taking courses with us. This is a woman that I'm with in this picture. She's with her daughter, who came to visit her mom when her mom was studying there. And again, seeing that her mom was pursuing an university degree, and that sort of opening up that opportunity for her. So it's all about really having this trusting space for people to learn from each other and to be honest and share. One of the things that I do in my classes at the end of the term is I ask students to share a bit about something, that experience that they had during the term. And this was a surprising thing that one of the students said, and this was Lisa, who again she came to university when she was about 40, single parent. She said that she was really comforted when she came to class and saw that there were other Indigenous students, because this is a big issue for students when they feel that they're the only Indigenous student. They feel less comfortable. But then she said she also felt nervous about the number of non-Indigenous students. And she said to us, "I thought that you non-Indigenous students would think I was a dumb Indian." So this was very, very powerful for us. It really took us aback when we heard Lisa say this, for a couple of reasons. We felt sad that she felt that way, but it was a powerful reminder that racism is really real. And this is, her perception of what people think about her. But the other thing that was important is that she trusted us to share this with us. And so that really makes, again, a testament to having a space where people can learn together and start to trust each other so that we can share these kinds of things with each other. So I just got a few more slides. Stopping the cycle of poverty, I think, really does begin with stopping the blame and the self-blame. So again, a student in class said one day that, I used to feel like a failure because I lived in poverty. I never realized it wasn't I who had failed, it was a system of policies that had failed me. So starting to feel really empowered that there's nothing wrong with me. I'm capable and I can do this, and starting to feel better about themselves. So again, people fall into poverty for different reasons. Many find their way out, but for those caught up in these intergenerational cycles of poverty, it's far more complicated for a whole host of reasons, some of which I've described. It's hard for those of us who've not grown up this way to understand this. And it is really easy for us to just kind of blame people and suggest, well, why don't you just get it together and, get a job and, turn your life around. And so whether or not we have that difficulty understanding it, the fact is that blaming people for their poverty is not going to pull them out of it. So we need to think ourselves again about how we can view things differently so that we can, make a more significant change and start to see these cycles broken. This is, again, speaking of the importance of having non-Indigenous students with more privilege coming to study in the inner city is important towards that goal of getting us to see things differently and try to understand differently and break out of the kind of the stereotypes that we've learned. So this was a student who studied with us, who talked about her, recognizing how she was very lucky the way that she grew up, was very grateful for her self-sheltered life. But also wishing that maybe she had been exposed to understanding things in a different way. And so was grateful that, experiencing her education with other people who had less than her made her start to see things differently. So just a couple of final thoughts then. I'd like to talk about charitable giving and poverty. So again, it's complex, and tackling child poverty, or any poverty through charitable giving is extremely important. And and those of us who can give and should give, and we do give, and this is extremely important. But ending the cycle of poverty requires some deep societal change in how we view poverty and what we do as a society to alleviate it. I firmly believe that children need to see hope and opportunity through the experiences of their parents. So they're going to believe what is possible if they see what is possible. And that's why it's important to also think about what we can do to help parents start to see what's possible for them. And so meeting the basic needs of children, of course, is crucially important, but creating hope, opportunity, and support for the adults in their lives who have known only poverty is also key to ending the cycle of poverty. So that is all I have to say today, and happy to hear any comments or questions.